Welcome. We're going to get started. People are still arriving, but I think we've got a full program. Thank you for joining us for the first in our lunchtime conference series entitled Quest for Quiet. My name is Tricia Glass. I'm a Quiet Communities board member, and I'll be one of the hosts during our conversation today. Quiet Communities is a national nonprofit dedicated to helping communities reduce health and environmental harm from news and pollution. To begin, I would like to thank our sponsors, Hearing Health Foundation, University of Washington School of Law Clinical Law Program, and the Environment section of the American Public Health Association. This first conference, working together to reduce noise and related pollution in America's communities, aims to connect communities to act and work together on noise issues while encouraging federal agencies to do the same. We will be introducing a new community conversation platform a bit later in the program. Before we begin, some housekeeping. Please sign into the chat with your name, organization, and email. Note that this event is being recorded. There are close to 300 participants today, so we ask that all please remain on mute unless you're called upon. For speakers, we ask that you remain within the allotted time. You'll hear a gentle warning bell should you go over. If you've signed in using the Quiet Communities moniker, please change your name so we know who you are. Please post your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can during the 3 Q&A sessions and the open discussion period at the end of the program. And now it is my privilege to welcome Arlene Bronsaft, a pioneer of noise abatement. Thank you, Arlene.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome to all of you. Here we are in 2022, and we're talking about what we can do to abate noise. And I'm just going to start this conference off when the US was involved in noise abatement back in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, in a booklet entitled Noise, a Health Problem, the United States clearly stated that noise was a health issue. And though the booklet does acknowledge that maybe some more research has to be done to link noise to mental and health problems, it still stated that it was a health problem. And I just really want to read the closing statement of that booklet, which said, "It is finally clear that noise is a significant hazard to public health. Truly, noise is more than just an annoyance." And this booklet was printed in 1978. It is 2022. Have we not progressed? Have we not gone forward? What's wrong? But this meeting today will, I hope, further our advocacy for a quieter, less noisy environment. And I look forward to speaking at this meeting further, to listening to our outstanding speakers, and to greet all the people who have joined us. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. And if you'll just bear with me for a minute, I'm going to share my screen. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this meeting. My name is Jamie Banks. I'm the president of Quiet Communities. I'm going to be speaking this morning very quickly about noise and its impacts on health to kind of give us all a common understanding of the hazards of noise. As Arlene mentioned, this problem is decades old. US Surgeon General William Stewart recognized and declared that noise is indeed a public health hazard, a matter for public health concern. And we understood even those 40 or 50 years ago, the sorts of non-auditory problems that occurred that include cardiovascular, endocrine, respiratory, and other effects that are mediated by stress. This was recognized by legislation, by the Clean Air Act of 1970. Under that act, the Office of Noise Abatement and Control, or ONAC, was established within the EPA to carry out the responsibilities of the subsequent Noise Control Act of 1972. And you see here what that act promised. It's a policy of the United States to promote an environment for all Americans free from noise that jeopardizes their health or welfare. That legislation is still on the books today. So we know that there's a lot of different sources of noise, and that many of these sources are tied to fossil fuels and come with related pollution. But there's other sources as well: headphones, consumer products, indoor venues, and so forth, that can cause excessive levels of noise dangerous to health. Noise has been called the new secondhand smoke. If you're not familiar with that, the reason why is because the public is being exposed involuntarily to a hazard. The auditory outcomes of noise exposure are damage to the ears, damage to the nerves of the ears. The damage is irreversible. Noise-induced hearing loss is one problem. Tinnitus, or ringing in the ears, and hyperacusis, hypersensitivity to certain forms of noise. In addition to hearing damage, there's certain things that have an increased risk. People that have hearing damage have increased risks of falls, depression, social isolation, and dementia. And all of this is associated with things like reduced work productivity, employability, quality of life, and then, of course, costs. I want to point out the excellent work that's being done by one of our promoters, Hearing Health Foundation. They have a campaign called Keep Listening. We'd encourage people to go to the website and see the excellent videos and information they have. Non-auditory outcomes include cardiovascular disease, mental health conditions, diminished learning, especially in children, metabolic disturbances, and again, these sorts of consequences that fall out of those conditions. Today, we understand why after noise exposure at the cellular and molecular levels. This is a very busy slide, but what it's saying is that when you're exposed to noise, it sets off a physiological cascade that ends up doing damage to the blood vessels and causes all kinds of problems in the body. And you see down here, heart disease, stroke, and there's other metabolic disturbances and so forth that can occur. And lastly, I'll just say understanding noise is not just about understanding loudness. You can have violin music that's very loud, but it's pleasurable. You can have other noises at that same level, and they're extremely disturbing. So characteristics that are really required to understand it include the ones listed here. Not just loudness, but the frequency of that sound. Is it low frequency and have a strong vibrational component? If it does, it might come through your walls and windows. It might have very serious adverse health effects. Is it repeated noise, repeated exposures that can sensitize the blood vessels to damage? What's the pattern of the noise, the duration of those exposures, and what is the tonality? Can that be disturbing to people? I'm going to end by mentioning the most recent policy statement from our Noise and Health Committee at the American Public Health Association. It's noise as a public health hazard. What I'm going to put in the chat is a link to resources that include this policy and many others so that people can easily access them. And with that, I'm going to conclude. So thank you for your time. Next, we're going to have Joan Casey from Columbia University. And Joan, let me just bring up your slide and you can get started.
That's a really good presentation.
Yeah, outstanding.
Looks
And
nice.
short.
Birch trees behind.
Just a reminder, please keep yourselves on mute.
Are we on mute?
Oh,
Joan, hold on just a minute, please.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Great. Jamie, do you want me to just go ahead and get started?
Sure. Let me
Okay.
stop sharing. And do you have a slide presentation to bring up, Joan?
I do. Oh, it's saying host disabled participant sharing. So someone might need to enable me.
Okay. Let's see. Trish, can you find Joan?
There are a lot of us here.
Let's see. Okay, let's see.
Well,
There
while that is getting fixed, I can just say hello. And nice to be here with you all. I see I'm now a co-host, so I'll go ahead and get sharing. Oh, let me get to this and just slide this up here. Great. Okay. So wonderful to be here with you all. I've been doing some work on noise pollution for, I don't know, the past 7 or 8 years. I echo the things that have already been brought up, but some of my work has been around environmental justice issues related to noise pollution. And so that's what I'm going to talk with you all about today. So sound waves, this is how we hear, right? Sound travels as a wave vibrating in the air, then it hits your ear and vibrates these bones, and eventually a message is relayed to your brain that you've heard a sound. We measure sound pressure, as Jamie mentioned, in decibels. Just to give folks a sense, this is a logarithmic scale. So if you see a doubling of decibel, or so a 10 decibel increase is a doubling of sound because it's a logarithmic scale. So if you see a 5 decibel change in noise, that's quite perceptible and meaningful. Noise is just unwanted sound. As mentioned, great intro for me, Jamie. Noise is not constant, right? It's fluctuating over time, and we have to figure out how to summarize exposure to noise. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is nighttime noise, which we think is particularly important for health. And I'm going to talk about the average level that is exceeded 50% of the time at night. So this is the level of sound that we have higher decibels than 50% of the time. And so evolution programmed human beings to be aware of sounds as possible sources of danger. So it's no surprise that noise activates our autonomic nervous system, our fight or flight nervous system, even when we're asleep. This can be problematic for health. The WHO in Europe has estimated that over 1 million disability-adjusted life years are lost annually due to environmental noise. And as Jamie mentioned, noise is associated with multiple health outcomes, things like sleep disturbance, stress, impaired cognitive performance, increased blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and adverse birth outcomes. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we see disparities in many of these same health outcomes along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. So we wanted to know if there are disparities in noise exposure in the United States and if racial segregation modify these relationships. So to look at this question, we used a nighttime noise model developed by the National Park Service. This is based on over 1 million hours of acoustic data that was collected inside and outside national parks. And they include a bunch of other spatial variables to predict these nighttime noise levels. And so we had essentially a grid across the United States of 270 by 270 meter estimates of noise. So very small resolution estimates of noise. And so we linked this with sociodemographic data from the census, information on race, ethnicity, poverty, and various other factors. And I'll show you just a subset of that today. And we were also interested in metro area segregation. And so basically what you need to know here is that this scale runs from 0 to 1. 0 represents no racial segregation. 1 represents total segregation. Here's the nighttime noise distribution that we estimated. And what you can see, of course, is that this really tracks a lot of people entering, which is great. This really tracks with where cities are located in the United States. So when we're zoomed out this far, it's a little bit difficult to see within city variability in noise, but you can kind of get a sense of levels of nighttime noise here in the US. And so what did we see when we wanted to look at disparities? Unfortunately, generally, we observed evidence of racial and socioeconomic disparities in noise pollution. So here's an example of this. On the x-axis here, we're looking at the percent of households that were linguistically isolated. So this means households where no one over the age of 12 speaks English well. And you can see that as the percent of households in linguistic isolation at the block group level, the neighborhood level, increased, we also saw this increase in nighttime noise. Similar finding for various racial ethnic groups. Here I'm going to show you Black race ethnicity. But as the percent of non-Hispanic Black individuals increased, we also saw an increase in nighttime noise. So I'm going to zoom in so you can kind of see what this distribution really looks like when we zoom in on the y-axis. And you can see going from 0% Black individuals to 100% Black individuals, we see this 1, 2, 3, 4 decibel increase in average nighttime noise in these communities. One more finding I'll share with you is median income, because this is kind of interesting, I think. We see this kind of U-shaped distribution where communities with the lowest levels of household income do in fact have the highest levels of nighttime noise. But we also see this uptick at the other end where more wealthy communities also have slightly elevated noise compared to the middle of the distribution. And we think we see this because people, if you think about major cities like New York City, where I'm located, it's quite desirable to live near transit, and transit is really loud. And so we think that this is driven by that fact in major cities like San Francisco, Chicago, New York. And so let me share here, this is the map of racial residential segregation. So the metro areas in red are the most segregated by this metric. Those in dark blue are the least segregated. And I'm now going to show you some of our results stratified by level of segregation. What I mean by that is when we're comparing, let's just take this dark blue line. This is the relationship between percent non-Hispanic Black and nighttime noise in the least segregated metro areas in the United States. So we can see as the percent of non-Hispanic Black individuals increases, we do see an increase in nighttime noise. But if we look at the red line, these are the most segregated cities in our country. And we can see the same relationship, but just overall higher levels of noise in these more segregated cities. And on average, if we compare a similar neighborhood in these two cities of about 50% non-Hispanic Black individuals, there's a 3 decibel increase in noise from the least to the most segregated city. We see a similar thing for percent non-Hispanic White individuals, where again, the least segregated cities are the quietest and the most segregated cities are the loudest. So fairly interesting relationships here, but these inequities in noise exposure appear to persist. So in conclusion, we saw these fairly consistent inequities in noise exposure across the continental United States. And we saw that block groups in more segregated metro areas were noisier for everyone, but these racial ethnic disparities persisted. So I will stop there and say thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, Joan, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We're going to stop and take about 5 minutes to take 2 or 3 questions. Trish, can you bring some up from the chat?
Yes, we don't have specific questions, but some interesting comments. Jeffrey Lewis is commenting on in aviation, nighttime noise is most problematic. So I'm not sure if someone would like to speak to that. And he's saying that's why we need congressional action.
I'm not sure. I mean, I agree that in general, nighttime noise is problematic. And one of the main sources of nighttime noise are airplanes, because many fewer people are using cars and public transit during the night. And so those levels of noise decrease, but we still have flights at night. So perhaps that's what they're speaking to. And I agree that it's an issue.
Trish, I'm sorry. I would also add that there's some physiological reasons as well. Blood pressure is more likely to go up with nighttime noise, and then even if people are sleeping. And I can't tell you exactly the mechanisms by which that happens, but there's more and more research coming out that shows that somehow nighttime noise is more hazardous.
And here's another comment about the increase in wealthy neighborhoods has to do with noise in wealthier neighborhoods tends to be about mowers and weed whackers. These are more comments and construction. Perhaps, let's see. Oh, here's a question. Given that the West Coast is highly non-segregated, does that skew the segregated areas higher than shown on the charts?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was trying to look about the cognitive functioning in children. I was going to drop a study there.
No, fine. Given that the West Coast is highly non-segregated, does that skew the segregated areas higher than shown on the charts?
Yeah, so it is possible because there are historic policies around land use and industrial activities that are also linked to segregation, things like redlining. And so it's possible that these looking at just segregated places on the West Coast. So it could be that the West Coast is quieter and it is less industrial and less segregated. So these things could kind of be tracking together, but I'd say they're related.
And you were probably just looking up this response, but can you point to recent data on the effect of noise on children learning?
Yeah, there are a couple pretty good recent studies. I was just trying to find this review article, so I'll put it in the chat when I get it here.
Terrific.
Yes, and Arlene, maybe you could speak to that briefly. You're muted.
All my studies, the original ones on the effects of rail noise on children's learning, was conducted in Inwood in New York City, and that was a poorer community where children came from homes that were lower income. The thing I'd like to add is that when it comes to noise, aircraft noise is an equal opportunity offender. It even offended Donald Trump, who lives in Florida and has sued because of the aircraft over his home. But let me add this, when you are poorer, and even though you're affected by noise, as my grandson, who is awakened at 5:45 in the morning because he lives in Queens, in an area where planes fly over, at least he can seek comfort at times when the planes are coming daily by going to his own private room. When it comes to poorer children, when they're impacted by noise from the outside, there's also more noise inside. Their homes are congested. Children have to share rooms. They don't have quiet spaces. And studies have been done which have shown that noisy homes do in fact impact adversely on children's learning. And those studies were done 40 years ago. So while we all are affected by noise, when you are living in a neighborhood that's poorer, you have less opportunity to seek areas that may be quieter. And that exacerbates the impact of noise on the people who live in those neighborhoods, especially the children.
And here's a specific question. Are the estimated noise levels based on traffic noise estimates in accordance with HUD DNL calculations?
So the noise levels that we used are not DNL. They're what I was saying, they're L50 noise estimates. So it's the level of noise that's exceeded 50% of the time at night. So it's a slightly different metric of noise calculation.
Terrific. And a question about, are there studies on whether helicopter noise, the effects of helicopter noise versus other jet aircraft sounds?
I'm not aware of helicopter specific noise studies. I've just seen aircraft noise versus other types of noise, but I think that would be interesting. Helicopters, as there was one over my neighborhood at 5:45 this morning in Inwood, actually, Arlene, where I live, it is extremely loud and very close. So that could be very interesting, but I haven't seen that. I don't know, Jamie or Arlene, if you've seen anything about helicopters specifically.
May I add? I could speak to this. When it comes to noise, I did my studies on rail noise, and those studies were used to curb aircraft noise at schools. Let's understand, aircraft noise adversely affects health, whether it be helicopters or planes. And I agree, the studies and the two studies I've done in New York City was aircraft. But when you're talking about noise, you can indeed generalize from one type to the other, just as the mother who called me about aircraft noise affecting her child and said, Dr. Bronzak, may I use your study on rail noise to get the FAA to respond to aircraft noise? And I said, of course. And so that study with other studies, not all done on aircraft noise, did indeed cause the FAA to spend several $100 million to quiet noise at schools. So while I understand as a researcher, you may want to do studies specifically on helicopter noise, because in some ways they may be flying over at different times, different heights. Noise is noise. And I think the helicopter noise people are justified in using the data and overwhelming data to demonstrate that aircraft noise does indeed affect our health.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just one more thing, Trish. One of the reasons we're here today is because we don't have an effective federal noise control program today. And funding for the kinds of studies that we might like to do has not been available. So when people ask questions, is there any research? One of the reasons is there's been no research funding for things like this. And this is not to take away from what Arlene said. There's enough research to know that noise causes health problems, but specific things like this often aren't addressed because there just hasn't been the funding to do it.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Arlene. And so I think in the interest of time, we'll shift to our next speaker, Sid Shapiro, who is a professor of law at Wake Forest Law School. Thank you, Sid.
Okay, Sid, I'll move to your presentation.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got the Noise Control Act and how we lost the Noise Control Act. In the 1970s, in the Johnson administration, we had this outpouring of health, safety, and environmental law. 28 statutes were passed, including the Noise Control Act. One of those has been defunded, the Noise Control Act, and it was a victim of the Reagan White House and its regulatory relief program. That was a deregulatory promise by President Reagan, which he carried out. And the White House picked out the Noise Control Act as a symbolic victim, or victory, I guess I should say, victim and victory for their deregulatory campaign. They did that in part because of the lack of organized opposition to the program. The Sierra Club and other major environmental organizations weren't watching, but they also did so because of three misjudgments. They thought federal regulation was unnecessary. They didn't take into account that defunding the program would freeze now out-of-date regulations in place. And they claimed that it was a state and community problem only. And I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about each of those. Jamie, if you could switch the slide. So
Sorry, Sid.
as you've been hearing, the idea that the Noise Control Act was unnecessary was wrong in 1981, and it's wrong now. And the previous presentations certainly went into that, as we've been discussing. Next, Jamie. One of the impacts of the Noise Control Act, because as you'll hear from Charles Elkins in a couple of minutes, they had a very active and effective noise control program that they started. And one aspect of that was product regulation. And they regulated a number of products, including buses, motorcycles, power lawnmowers, trucks, and they established requirements of noise abatement for each of these products. When the program was defunded, that kept all of these regulations in place, and under a legal concept called preemption, when there is federal regulation in place, that prohibits localities and communities from regulating a product any differently than the federal regulation. EPA has no way of updating these now old standards on these various products. And the fact that they're frozen in place means that communities can't regulate them differently either. So we're stuck with many out-of-date regulations concerning some very noisy aspects of our lives. And there's nothing we can do about it until and unless the Noise Control Act is either refunded or the substantive regulation itself is ended. Last slide, Jamie. The idea that this is a local problem is also a fundamental mistake. First, as again, you're going to hear when you hear a description of what the program was doing, centralized expertise lowers transaction costs. There's a lot of expertise, scientific and otherwise, involved in choosing effective noise abatement techniques. And EPA was in a position to do that for the entire country. So instead of having every community and maybe state try to figure this out on its own, we could figure it out in one place, and that was very effective. The noise control program also was charged with facilitating coordination in noise abatement, and that included coordination with aircraft noise abatement, and a central office is essential for that function. It also avoids conflicting local regulations. So communities are free to regulate products that weren't regulated by EPA, and that can create different product requirements, assuming communities do that, in different areas. So we have this patchwork quilt of different kinds of regulation. And it's much better to have a national federal regulation for a product across the country, so everybody gets the protection and manufacturers only have to meet one set of standards. And finally, as you were just hearing about from Jamie, the existence of the Noise Control Office facilitated further research into noise and its impacts on health. And the federal government was able to effectively channel that funding in a way that communities themselves cannot do. So for all those reasons, this was a fundamental mistake, and one, as you heard from Marlene, that we've been unable to rectify in over 40 years. Thank you.
And next on our schedule, we'll hear from Jill Mintz, Professor of Law, Nova Southeastern College of Law. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. I'm going to speak about some features of the still existing but unfunded Federal Noise Control Act that CIGPIRA didn't have a chance to get to. And I'll speak specifically about requirements that apply to EPA, requirements that apply to manufacturers of products, and provisions that allow enforcement of the Act's requirements, both by EPA and by private citizens. First of all, as to requirements applicable to EPA, EPA is required to publish regulations for major sources of noise that set noise emission standards which protect public health and well-being. EPA must also develop and disseminate public information on the various public health effects of noise and the most effective way to control noise. The agency is required to conduct or finance research on the effects, measurement, and control of noise. It is directed to investigate and develop noise control technology and noise monitoring equipment. It's also required to certify low noise emission products that can be substituted for noise emitting products, and finally provide grants to local and state governments for their use in developing state and local noise reduction programs. With regard to manufacturers of products, under the Act, EPA is required to establish and maintain records, and or the manufacturers, I should say, must establish and maintain records and provide any information that EPA requires. They must allow EPA officials to have access to information that they're required to keep. They must make products coming off the assembly line available for testing by EPA, produce products that conform to federal noise control requirements, and refrain from removing or rendering inoperative any noise control equipment. Finally, with regard to provisions allowing enforcement of the Act's requirements by EPA and private citizens, the Noise Control Act allows for two types of enforcement: enforcement by EPA and citizen suit enforcement. EPA, through the Department of Justice, may bring a criminal prosecution against any manufacturer who, quote, willfully or knowingly violates the Noise Control Act. A first criminal violation may lead to penalties up to $37,000 per day and or imprisonment for up to a year. And subsequent offenses may subject a violator to $68,000 per day in penalties and or up to 2 years in federal prison. EPA may also impose civil penalties of up to $10,000 per day of violation where it cannot prove that a violator has acted willfully or knowingly. The agency may also seek a court order restraining manufacturers from violating the Act. As I mentioned, the statute also authorizes any person, any citizen, any person without qualification to sue a manufacturer for violation of a noise control requirement under the Act. Any citizen is also authorized to sue EPA in federal district court for failing to perform any non-discretionary duty called for under the Act. In summary, the Federal Noise Control Act is a strong and enforceable statute that provides quite a few tools for reducing noise. Without funding, as Shapiro mentioned, it cannot be implemented. However, if and when Congress authorizes and appropriates money to restart EPA's noise control program, the act will be a very valuable tool in reducing noise pollution across the United States. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. We had allotted time for Q&A, but I think we'll skip this Q&A grouping and go on to our next speaker, just so that we can get to the open discussion at time at the end. So hope to get in. There are so many fantastic questions and comments. So next we hear from Chuck Elkins, former director, Noise Control Program, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you, Chuck.
Well, thank you. One of the reasons we're talking about the Noise Control Act today is because that act is still on the books. The only thing that is missing is money. So we don't need the Congress to go off and decide that noise control needs a new act and we need to get it done. What we need is for EPA to actually spend the money. And many of us have been talking to EPA recently to try to persuade them. And one of the things that they've said back to us is, you know, we never hear from people about noise control. So why should we fund it? And so I'm hoping that maybe this can change over time. Let me go to my slides and just summarize the next slide, if you would. What you've just heard, what we lost in 1981, the research on all the effects of noise, which can be done centrally by the federal government, the setting of the national standards for noise products, and then enforcement of the already established regulations, heavy duty trucks, motorcycles, railroad noise, construction equipment. And one of the things that Joel mentioned a minute ago is that citizens can bring lawsuits to enforce these. So for instance, if you're in a community and you are upset about motorcycles being fitted with straight pipes, so they make a lot of noise as they go down the street, you can sue, you the citizens can sue the person who is selling those straight pipes, because that's a violation of the rule that's on the books, even though it's not funded. And then public education about noise, of course, would really help us and as we try to sell noise control at the local community. And perhaps most important for the community side is we were able to give back in the 1970s grants and technical assistance to local communities because we had the money to do that. And that helped communities get their ordinances in line. Next slide, Jamie. So I want to talk about just one program that I think was really one of the most successful programs we had, and I'm wondering whether we don't need it again. As I say here, controlling the noise at the community level is not rocket science, but it does take a combination of skills, as many of you have found out as you've worked on this at your community level. You need the technical knowledge about noise and how to measure it. You need ideas about how the solutions might work. You need some good arguments and facts to persuade local leaders to pay attention to this. And of course, you need some organizational skills to get the support from the public. And what we found in the Each Community Helps Others program, which we called ECHO, was that EPA could help one community go and share their expertise with another without federal people having to be there. And so just to give you an example, if this is hypothetical in this case, but we did do this in real cases. If Sioux Falls is interested in having an ordinance passed so they can control motorcycle noise, but the Sioux Falls Police Department is a little hesitant about that. If there's a program in Des Moines that is already working, Each Community Helps Others concept would be that a person from the Des Moines Police Department would talk to the Sioux Falls Police Department and tell them how it works, what the problems were, and how to do it well. And then that might then persuade the department to be willing to do that in Sioux Falls and convince the city council there in Sioux Falls to go ahead and pass the ordinance without any federal involvement, just simply enabling local communities to help each others. And so the question which we want to raise later in this meeting is, should we try to create among ourselves, community people across the country, an ECHO type network? So thank you very much. That's the end of my slides. Oh, we do have a slide here that if you do want to write EPA and say, well, you may not have been hearing about noise being a problem in our communities, but here it is. Here's the person that you can write. He is the acting assistant administrator for air and noise, air and radiation. It used to be called air, noise, and radiation. Now it's just air and radiation. And he understands about the Noise Control Act and has heard from us that for a couple $1 million, he can get this program started back up. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. And back to Arlene, who will suggest some solutions.
I'm going to start with a solution that enabled the founding members of our country to write the Constitution that is the foundation of our democracy. Knowing that noise from passing wagons and horses would intrude upon their writing of the Constitution at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, they placed dirt on the cobblestones outside the building. This created a quieter environment, allowing them to work more quickly and productively. And that, I would say, our founding fathers were indeed wise. And that solution brought us this country, which I am proud to be a citizen of. In terms of other solutions, after my study on the effects of rail noise on children's learning when their classrooms were adjacent to the elevated train tracks, the Transit Authority did indeed come up with ways to quiet the tracks with the resilient rail fasteners. That was the solution. The Transit Authority then developed quieter traction motors. I assisted with that. That was the solution. We know from Jamie Banks and her work on lawn equipment that can be quieter. That's a solution. We also know that when the Office of Noise Abatement and Control was open and existed, that they had solutions on their calendar. We know that architects and designers can focus on homes being quieter, not just beautiful. Please go to the quiet zone of Owens and Corning, and you'll see how homes can be designed from the get-go to be quieter. So we also know that electric planes are quieter. And I was pleased to meet Eric Lindbergh, grandson of Charles Lindbergh, whom I say has aviation in his DNA. And we bonded very closely because he believed planes could be quieter. I can go on and on in terms of design. We know that there are solutions and they should be used. But then there's another solution, and that's called respect. Respect for other people. So many complaints in New York City and large urban centers come from neighbors who complain about other neighbors. And that's a matter of respect. We do not play our music loudly. We should not be walking over wooden floors. And when it comes to respect, the Federal Aviation Administration should respect the people in this country because they know that they can do something to lessen the noise. So respect is key. Education. We should all know that noise is harmful to our health. Start with yourself. Your hearing is important. Do not listen to loud music. Protect yourself from noise. Education is key. Our children should be educated. I urge everyone to go to the New York City Department of Environmental Protection for the sound and noise module, which teaches children, it's curriculum for children, that they should be quiet to protect their hearing, their mental and physical health, and they should also urge others to be quiet. Today, we don't have to depend on the monitors set up by airports to know how noisy the planes are coming over our head. We can place sensors on our windows, and we'll have more accurate data, and we'll register that 545 plane. And my colleagues, Dr. Tyhug Park and his associates, have been producing these sensors. That's a solution. We have the solutions. And now and legislation, key, ordinances. But the point that I want to make about legislation, passing is not sufficient. Enforcement is key. Legislation is not worth the paper it's written on if it's not enforced. First example, the Noise Control Act. That legislation is still on the books and we haven't enforced it. But I would like to conclude with former Administrator of EPA Russell Train and what he said to a 1976 Internoise conference. He was talking about aircraft noise. He said air carriers can and should retrofit or replace the most noisy aircraft remaining in their fleet. Pilots should learn to fly their aircraft more quietly by following noise reduction methods. Aircraft manufacturers can and should make aircraft substantially quiet. And his talk went on to talk about airports and what they can do. 1976, quote, this is what he said: "We really know what needs to be done. We have simply lacked the will to do it. Let's get on with the job." It's the will that's lacking. And each one of us knows that when we want to get something done, if we put our minds and hearts to it, we get it done. And that's how individuals get the will. They have the will to succeed. You want good grades at school? Study, work hard. And that's what we have to say to all the people that have imposed noise on us. The solutions are there. Get the will. And hopefully this session will allow the people who are attending to push for greater quiet in our environments. Let's not dismiss that. That's healthier and less noise. And hopefully the will follow when we push. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. And now, Rick, I will pass it to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here with these figures who you've been hearing from and all of you who are attending. And thank you for being here and bringing your hearts and minds. So this issue was once recognized and then society buried its head in the sand. And because government went silent on the issue, that allowed the world to continue to fill with unnecessary noise. And as a result of the federal government withdrawal, the issue was scattered to the winds, to local communities to take care of. So what we're trying to do here today is reverse that process and bring the communities back together. Because if we have a national conversation on abating noise, we can form a more powerful and effective response. We can help each other to deal with noise on the local level. And together we can get states, federal, and even international bodies to respond. And as was mentioned in chat, the supply side, we need cultural change. We can change corporate, official, and popular cultures, but not if we're silent, like the government became. So we have to raise our voices so that the voice of quiet is heard. So today we have with us by great fortune the very person who ran EPA's ECHO, which was the mechanism for bringing communities together back in ancient times. And, this is a role of government that people don't often think about. The role the government plays of bringing people together, convoking, convening, and assisting with coordination of various efforts. And that is a major thing that EPA does. There are even some people who think it's the most important thing that government could do in a democracy, is assist communities coming together. Now, some of you know that Quiet Communities has submitted a petition to EPA to restore the program, and that would possibly include ECHO. And we've also met with some high EPA officials, and we've talked about this with them. So we've gotten the conversation started. And we should ask EPA and the government and our states and our local communities to convene discussions so that there are public discussions of this issue happening. So it's in people's minds so that we begin that process of real cultural change. But what if EPA doesn't come through? If EPA does not restore the program, I don't think it's a question, as Chuck posed it a minute ago. I think we should assert an answer that there should be an ECHO or something like it anyway, and we should come together anyway, even if EPA doesn't step up to the bat. So with that in mind, I would like to ask Chuck now to talk about his vision for how an ECHO or an ECHO Quiet type effort could work, what it looks like. Let's just talk about that for a bit.
Well, my mother had a saying that she always would give me when I was complaining, and she'd say, you know, God helps those who help themselves. And it seems to me we might say the same thing about the government. The government helps those who help themselves. I think we shouldn't wait for EPA. I really do hope EPA starts up the noise program again. But even if it doesn't, that doesn't mean we're helpless. We need to help ourselves. The other day, I was testifying along with others at a local hearing in New Haven, Connecticut, and it wasn't just people from New Haven who testified. There were others from other communities who gave voice to the need for the law. And I think we've seen this in other communities across the country now, particularly about leaf blowers. I think there are a lot of things we can do to help each other. Each of us, I think, have been probably successful in some ways with regard to noise in our communities, but we probably have also had some problems. If we can communicate with each other, perhaps we can help each other even more. And one of the first steps the Quiet Communities has done, Jamie, maybe if you move the slide here, to create a page on the website for Quiet Communities. It's still in the works. It's not quite ready to be used, but Jamie, give us a view of what it looks like. Do you have a slide there? What it in its current form, which needs a little work. The idea would be we would have conversations among ourselves across the country on various topics, and we've populated it here with a few topics you can see. And the thought would be in a few days when this website's ready to launch, we would email you and let you know the address. And we would hope that these conversations would be sparked across all these various topics, and we'll find the people in Sioux Falls, we'll find the people in Des Moines who can help. And people can suggest various solutions and arguments of whatever facts that could be helpful to other communities. So I think that's the vision to have. We got 200 people on this on the program today. Did you know that there are 200 people who care this much about noise across the country that they would spend 2 hours of their time? I bet most of you didn't think that. Now you know there are at least 200, and there were a lot more who signed up who are reachable. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to do something.
Thank you, Chuck. I don't know how we are on time, if we want to open it up or discuss this further or move on.
I think that we should stop and maybe take a couple of questions. We have two case studies coming up. So I think we have to be brief, Trish, but maybe just take 2 questions and then I think we should move through.
Okay, I definitely, let's see.
Or actually, you know what? I'm just looking at the time.
I know.
We have Congresswoman Grace Meng coming, who only has 5 minutes. She'll be here at 1:15. So maybe we should just move on to the case studies, and then in the open discussion, we can take all the questions.
I think that sounds perfect. There are so
Okay.
many good comments and questions, so we'll leave that for the end.
Okay, perfect. Let me bring up then our first case study. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Jerry Leonard, who's a resident of his neighborhood, Melrose Place. This is a community that's been facing a problem of industrial noise. And also Andrea Bomalaski from Tulane University Law Clinic, who's been working with Jerry on the case. So Jerry, can you start, please?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry Leonard. I represent the Melrose Place community here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I have prepared a statement to read to you guys today. For over 2 years, our residential community has been enduring a noise-induced situation with an industrial printing facility company that's only about 30 to 40 yards away from us, that's generating extremely loud and disturbing noises throughout the day and night from a new trash compactor and a fan that whines, a new open-top dumpster that makes explosions when trash is dumped in it, as well as an aged and repaired manual trash compactor that makes explosions, a compressor that hisses on a frequent basis, and loudly beeping vehicles that can beep for up to 15 minutes at a time. Sleep disruption, anxiety, and high blood pressure are the types of health issues that have developed due to our situation over the last 2 years. Members of the community, such as seniors and children, are affected. Earplugs, therapists, and medication have been used to combat the noises. We tried speaking to the company directly about the matter initially, but to no reasonable avail. Our city's noise inspector came out after that and initially made a decision to fine the company in violation of the city's noise ordinance, but that decision never came to fruition. We've spoken to several of the city's politicians about the matter, all the way up to the mayor's office, but again, to no reasonable avail. From there, we had to take matters into our own hands. With help from Quiet Communities, we've been able to get Tulane Environmental Law Clinic involved on the matter. Take it away, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Hello, everyone. It is a huge honor to be able to speak today alongside some amazingly brilliant minds. My name is Andrea Bomalaski, and I am a student attorney at the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. I, along with my colleagues at the clinic, represent Jerry as a client. As you heard from Jerry, his neighborhood is being overwhelmed with excessive noise emissions coming from an adjacent lot where a printing production plant is located. I'm going to just briefly talk about what it's been like working on this case. Notably, we have encountered certain obstacles that we suspect exist in areas not limited to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. For instance, we have encountered different gaps in the law. So the nature of the noise that is being emitted right next to Jerry's house is especially disturbing due to the underlying vibrations that the noises are causing. However, where the law attempts to address noise issues, it focuses on noise levels alone, typically only recognizing legal violations after a certain decibel threshold is met and making no distinction between tonal levels. So we see that legislation is needed to address these different qualities of noise. On top of that, we also see an administrative gap at the local government level. Complaints are handed around to different departments, and the current process is not set up in a way that allows recognition of certain legal nuances. For instance, noise issues are typically addressed by local police or addressed by an expensive and time-consuming nuisance lawsuit. However, in theory, the existence of excessive noise emissions may also contribute to a violation of a zoning ordinance, a building code, etc. That area of the law is not handled by the police and is instead handled by different departments in the municipality. In those cases, dealing with zoning and building codes, the noise is not so much the violation, but evidence of a violation of those laws. And so this nuance we're finding is not easily grasped by the local system. Additionally, and unfortunately, we are dealing with the harsh reality that protecting a business is heavily favored under the state law over holding that business accountable for excessive noise emissions. Louisiana is a business-friendly state, so finding sufficient relief can be extremely difficult. I also want to echo what Sid Shapiro and Joel Mintz said in making note that the federal government stepping up to the plate with a sufficiently funded program is necessary. As I mentioned, we're fairly certain this issue is not limited to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and meaningfully addressing noise emissions issues head on at the federal level would help ensure a more widespread effect. As science progresses, more adverse health effects caused by noise are being recognized by various studies. It's time that the law catches up with the science. So, because of these obstacles, we're being creative. We're taking a multi-pronged approach to tackle this issue from every angle possible. Jerry is such a great self-advocate and also an amazing community advocate. His neighborhood is very lucky to have him. I want to thank you so much for giving me the time to speak today and speak on these issues regarding the various legal setbacks that we've faced. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Jerry. Our next case study is from Paula Spina from Washington State, the Whidbey Island area. And let me just pull up her slide.
Jamie, are we good for time with the Congresswoman, or do we need to squeeze her in before me?
We have exactly 5 minutes, Paula. So I think
You owe
we're
me
good.
7, Jamie. All right, I'll go quickly.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Paula Spina, I represent both citizens of the Ebey's Reserve and also the Sound Defense Alliance. Military noise, especially jet noise, is in a different category from other noise because it's essentially unregulated. The predominant source of noise in central Whidbey, where I live, is U.S. Navy jet training. Whidbey Island is located about 35 miles north of Seattle at the entrance to the Puget Sound. Starting in the late 1800s, fixed fortifications had been built on Whidbey and across Admiralty Inlet to guard the entrance to Puget Sound. By World War II, aircraft had replaced forts for this defense. Naval Air Station Whidbey Island was located in Oak Harbor with small outlying landing fields called OLFs in Coopville, Mount Vernon, and Arlington. By the early 1960s, Whidbey Island, Naval Station Whidbey Island was no longer needed to defend the Sound. With the advent of the Vietnam War, their mission changed. It went from defending Northwest cities to one of training for overseas deployments. However, despite the fact that neither the main base nor the Coopville OLF met Navy requirements, jet training was brought to Whidbey Island. Even in 1965, citizens didn't want jet noise over their homes, farms, schools, and opposition arose, even among our county leadership. But there was a war on, and Navy jets stayed. Since then, civilian opposition has surged and waned in conjunction with the ebb and flow of training activity. The Navy has spent decades inculcating itself into county government in order to protect the space from community opposition. Today, the center of opposition remains Coopville, where the Navy conducts field carrier landing practice, FCLPs, or generically touch and goes. Among other shortcomings, the Coopville OLF is too short. It is located in a migratory bird flyway and is too close to residential neighborhoods. There are 1,150 homes within 1/2 mile of the 2 flight paths. This number corresponds to the Navy's estimate of 1,200 homes within a 65 decibel DNL zone, and that's an average. The actual number of homes subjected to incident decibel levels exceeding 110 is far greater. Noise complaints come from as far away as Port Townsend, which is 5 to 10 miles away when the growlers are training at the OLF. In 2005, the Navy published an environmental assessment announcing its plan to replace its prowler fleet on Whidbey with the growler. In support of this transition, the Navy represented to citizens that their impacts would be lessened with this new jet because there would be fewer operations and because the growler for most operations was quieter than the prowler it would replace. When the growlers actually started training in 2011, I note that was 5 years after the 5-year statute of limitations expired, our community immediately knew it had been deceived. Not only were impacts not lessened, they were significantly worse. The public once again became enraged, got engaged, and our organization Corps was formed to lead the fight against the growler. The Navy, in response, doubled down and decided to single site all of the nation's growlers on Whidbey. They then moved their electronic warfare training from the Idaho desert to the Olympic National Forest, bringing jet noise to the quietest square inch. And in 2018, they published an environmental impact statement expanding the number of growlers and quadrupling the number of FCLPs at the OLF. Corps sued. To date, we have filed 3 lawsuits against the Navy. Our latest, under the National Environmental Policy Act, had a big success recently when the federal magistrate on the case recommended judgment in our favor. We're waiting to see if the judge will follow that recommendation. We're also preparing another suit under the Endangered Species Act because jet noise doesn't just impact humans. The fight on Whidbey is a good representation of community fights around the country over noise and other forms of pollution related to military training. There's a fight in every community where military jets overfly civilian populations. Everyone knows that military training activities and civilian populations do not mix. Congress has provided millions of acres of reservation for military activities, yet military training activities still regularly take place over civilians. The Navy knows it has a problem on Whidbey, and it has other locations where growlers could train without impacting civilians or our fragile environment. But they like living on Whidbey, and they don't like being told what they can or can't do. These fights are not easy. Most communities cannot muster the volunteer time or incredible sums of money to successfully fight the military. And communities often have to fight their own elected leaders and members of Congress who have been co-opted by military and defense industries. Coupeville residents have been waging this fight for 57 years. We are exceptional in that regard. 2 last quick remarks. Growler training, because it is so close to schools in Coupeville and Oak Harbor, frequently causes interruptions in the classrooms. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, teachers report students have difficulty concentrating during training sessions. Island County's public health officers have acknowledged these health issues, but were unwilling to take any action so as not to offend the Navy. Corps had more success with the State Health Department. Because of our efforts, the State Department of Health submitted a request to the Navy to perform a noise health study. The Navy rejected that request out of hand. Congress needs to remind the Navy and the military that they are here to defend, not to harm us. Thank you. More information can be found. Oh, can't show it. I will post our websites on the chat line. And thank you so much for hosting us today.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was great. And Jerry and Andrea, thank you too. That was a wonderful presentation. Trish, do you know if Congresswoman Meng has joined us?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Hi. Thank you so much. It's our honor today to welcome our featured speaker, Congresswoman Grace Meng from the 6th District of New York. Congresswoman Meng has really been a leader on noise issues. She's a founder and former co-chair of the Congressional Quiet Skies Caucus and a principal sponsor of the Quiet Communities Act of 2021. And Congresswoman Meng, I have a face sheet that I can put up for you, and then you can go ahead and begin. Let's see.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. I'm Congresswoman Grace Meng, proud to represent parts of Queens, New York, and really want to say a tremendous thank you to Quiet Communities for organizing this event, for your continued commitment to noise mitigation. I see some of my constituents here today. I see Maria Becce. I don't know if I'm missing anyone else. I don't have the full screen, but don't get mad if I've left anyone out. But constituents and leaders like Maria have been working overtime here in our congressional district in New York on combating this issue. And as you mentioned, as a founding member of the Quiet Skies Caucus, I've spent my entire time in Congress. It was the first press conference I ever had, even before I got elected, working to reduce the impact of airplane noise on our public. I represent a district that sits between New York's two busiest airports, LaGuardia and Kennedy. And we know firsthand here, our families know the detrimental effects that airplane noise can have on public health. It's not just an issue that I work on when I'm away in Washington, but it's an issue that I live with alongside so many of my neighbors. And neighborhoods like my own, which are about 10 miles from some of these airports, can and have really been tormented by airplane noise. And this far exceeds being just a quality of life issue, because as study after study continues to affirm, this is a public health issue. This affects the public health of our families, our seniors, our children, and everyone in between. And as air travel returns to normal, I expect airplane noise to become an even greater issue going forward again. But the FAA, the agency responsible for overseeing airplane noise's effects on our public, neither has the resources nor, quite frankly, wants to prioritize adequately addressing this issue. But as many of you know, this has not always been the case. The responsibility to mitigate airplane noise used to rest on the Environmental Protection Agency. More specifically, the agency had an Office of Noise Abatement and Control. The purpose of this office, in line with the EPA, was to regulate noise pollution to mitigate its effects on public health. Unfortunately, this office has been dormant since being defunded back during the Reagan administration. And that's why I was proud to introduce the bipartisan Quiet Communities Act of 2021, a bill that would reestablish this office, the Office of Noise Abatement and Control. This bill would require this office to carry out a study of airport noise and examine the FAA's selection of noise measurement methodologies, health impact thresholds, and abatement program effectiveness. And while I know that this bill is far from silver bullet, it is a crucial step in reframing how our federal government tackles this issue. Of course, some of the largest gains in airplane noise mitigation in the last 4 decades have come from technological and design advancements that have made planes more efficient and quieter. And I believe that technology will continue to be key in mitigating airplane noise over the long term in years and decades to come. And that's why we have to start already by crafting sound policy that incentivizes technological advancements that prioritize noise reduction. As a member of our House Appropriations Committee, which is responsible for funding the federal government, I've continued to fight for provisions in our spending bills that push innovation in these noise mitigation technologies. For example, recently I was able to help secure about $67 million for next-gen environmental research aircraft technologies and fuels, of which $37.5 million is for the continuous lower energy emissions and noise program to accelerate the development of aircraft and engine technologies in the 2022 fiscal year spending bill. I also helped secure $8 million for the FAA to support regular engagement with communities, because this has not been done adequately. Communities affected by aviation noise, something that's really still lacking sufficiently enough. But rest assured, I will continue to lead our fight for legislation and funding that reduces airplane noise and its effects on the public. It's an issue that is very personal to me and to all the families in the majority of my district. So I really want to thank Quiet Communities once again for inviting me to speak. I will continue to rely on your expertise and our communications to guide sound policy situations to address this dire public health crisis, and really appreciate all of you for your great work. It's really very instrumental to this process. And stay safe, everyone, and happy early St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, Representative Meng. If I could just ask one question, and it's very quick. If you had to recommend something that the folks here on the meeting could do that could be helpful in pushing this forward, what might that be?
So I assume folks here are from all over the country, and as with many issues, oftentimes we get the loudest feedback and response from, let's say, people in our own district. But I also want to make sure, as with many issues, that members on both sides of the aisle are hearing it across the board. So however we can work, whether it's social media, whether it's even like a local op-ed, you know, in your own districts around the country. My ideal wish would be that every Congress member would be aware of this issue and prioritize it, because, you know, Congress can be a funny place. Public sentiment can really create much needed momentum on any given issue at any time. And so a lot of this is like marketing, and how do we create that public sentiment to give us momentum for these bills.
Thank you. And thank you for your time today.
And to that, to add personal stories too, right? It sounds very, if it's not something that affects you, it sounds something very technical, esoteric, nothing to do with you. But if you give personal testimonies on, you know, someone who is saying how it affects their children or their day-to-day quality of life, you know, I think that personal stories can always be more impactful as well.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, take care. So Trish, I'm going to hand it back to you for open discussion for you and Rick.
Yes, and Rick is going to lead the open discussion, but I thought we would start. So during this time, if you would like to participate, raise your hand and Rick will call on you, or I will if I see it first. But I thought I'd start with Sally Lusk, who had a question. So if you could just take yourself off mute, that would be great.
Thank you, Tricia. I was interested in finding out about whether the data regarding the noise in the communities had been in any way correlated with health disparity, disease rates for those communities.
Is Joan still with us? I'm not sure, Sally, if she is. But if you put the question in chat, we can forward it to Joan and have her get in touch. Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
And Trish, you think we can go to Donna and Andrea quickly?
Yes, I think that would be great.
Okay. This is Donna. Is it my turn?
Yes,
Please.
thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this Zoom meeting, because I've never been to one that's been so well represented as far as people from across the country. Secondly, I live in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. We retired here 7 years ago, and it was just what you would imagine if you went to go camping in Colorado. Beautiful, mountainous, quiet, moose everywhere and elk. It was really amazing. When we bought our cabin in the mountains, we put our elbows on our railing. We said, listen to that. It was silence. So fast forward to now, since the FAA has implemented their plan to restructure all of their flight paths to go in a cross section in our states, all of our states. It has increased the jets coming over our house about every 12 minutes. We get these jets. I know that we're not the only ones, but we formed a committee up here. We were successful in getting Stephen Dixon, the former administrator of the FAA, here in Denver at the Capitol building twice. And once, the last time he was here just before the pandemic hit, he said, you know, nothing's chiseled in stone, which really gave us the hope that, look, maybe the FAA really will effectively at least test in these areas where these jets are just bouncing, the sound is bouncing off the rocks, and people come here to be quiet. So I would like to know, does anybody know who's going to be in charge of the FAA now that Administrator Dixon has retired, and whether they would be more amenable to working with people who have this problem? Also, is there a way that we all can get connected as far as fighting the noise from the jets as opposed to, cars and motorcycles? Well, yeah, we have that too, but these jets are flying right over our house.
Well, I'll just say, I don't know that we're going to get the answer to the first part of your question right now about the next FAA head. If someone does have that, please put it in chat or speak up. But I do think that what we're trying to do here is create conversations around these various issues. So yes, we're trying to bring together a coherence, a coalescence of people who are concerned with each one of these issues, under the umbrella of their commonality as well. So this is something that we all need to try to do together. So thank you for that. Let's move on. And if you could be brief, because we have probably a lot of comments to hear from. Andrea.
Hi, I'm in the Long Island area. And for years I've had, for the last couple of years, it's been a plane problem. I've been going to meetings. I forgot which one, maybe it was the round table, and nothing has changed. It might be a little less since the pandemic. It was coming out like every 2 minutes. We were getting planes seems a little less, but still bad. And so that's kind of, in the background more, but now it's more of a problem. The last year or two, I guess since the pandemic started, is a muffler problem I guess it's a fad, I don't know, but people driving around without mufflers, and they're backfiring in the middle of the night. And I live near a main road, but I'm still, I've lived here for many, many years, never had this before. I'm not right on the main road, I'm several roads in. So it reverberates, I guess. But all hours of the night, firecrackers, mufflers, loud motorcycles. And this is a really nice professional community. We pay high taxes to have to try to take a walk and have to deal with that. I don't know. I'm ready thinking moving out, but people tell me that it's all over now. That's a very big fad, and there's a law out. Apparently Hochul made a law up fining people that had no mufflers, but the police tell me that they can't catch everybody, that it's a constant thing. I don't know what to say. Now I'm thinking, maybe can I invest in windows? I don't know if that such thing exists, that soundproof windows. If anyone can help with that, I don't know. Otherwise, I feel like I have to move, which is didn't want to. I love the neighborhood, and very sad. I've lived here almost my whole life, and it was always a quiet, beautiful neighborhood. Never had anything like this.
So thank you very much for that, Andrea. There's so many aspects to this noise problem that we do need to cover all of them. They're all important. I just saw in chat a message saying, what about leaf blowers? Their absence is conspicuous. We actually did a whole conference on leaf blowers in December, and leaf blowers is something we work on all the time. We will be talking more about leaf blowers, and you can get a copy of the conference and watch it. We'll show if someone could.
That doesn't bother me so much. I have it out here now because they have to do their job, but I'm talking about kids, whoever is doing this thing with the mufflers.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think Arlene would like to respond to Andrea quickly.
Yes, let me respond to Andrea.
Thank you.
In New York City, in New York State, we just passed a law that's going to be addressing mufflers. And I agree with you. You still have to have the police to issue violations. But one of the things we're also going to do are going to penalize those garages that alter the mufflers so that these cars can be souped up. So if you contact me, I'll try to fill you in on what's happening in New York. Let me also introduce something else that's taking place in Knoxville and in New York City. We're going to have noise cameras. New York City is experimenting with what is being experimented in London and in Paris. And we're going to have a camera try to identify the car that's making the noise. And at the same time, it has a sound meter. So we're moving into a new era where we'll be able to monitor noisy cars with cameras. It's only a pilot study, but it's starting in New York City. And you know that's going to be a problem in New York City. The pilot study's in Paris, it's in London, which tells all of us that they are concerned about these vehicles that are souped up, rushing down the streets and imposing their noise. So if anyone wants more information, please, you could contact me. I've written a blog for the Quiet Coalition, but I wanted to have people know that this issue is being addressed worldwide. And hopefully by penalizing the offenders, the people who change the equipment in the cars to make them noisier, as well as those who are driving, possibly will have a reduction. The thing also about the sleep act that I've asked our state senator, it's one thing to introduce legislation, but I would ask every legislator who introduces a bill to also introduce a study to see how effective that bill has actually been in remedying the situation. You can't just pass legislation, assume it's enforced. You should be obligated to go back to see if noise has actually been reduced. Anyone wants to speak to me further on this, please let me know. Let me just add that as a researcher, when I found that noise affected children's learning, I didn't just publish a paper. I got the city to reduce the noise, and that is key, and we can all do that. Thank you.
Hey, what about firecrackers? That's another big problem all year round, middle of the night. What are they doing about that? That's
well, in New
really
York
big.
City, same thing. We have an organized group, actually a group organized in Upper Manhattan, in Inwood and Washington Heights, that's going to try to address that issue. And they're working together because the summer is coming. The issue is we have laws, we don't enforce them. And unless our legislators have to produce results that show their laws have changed things and things have become quieter, then our legislators have not done the job. It's not enough to just pass. So that's what I'm focusing on and working with community in New York City on this very issue of fireworks.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm in Long Island.
Andrea, please, I think we should give
That's
some more people a
Oh,
chance to.
just one thing. What about the windows? Does someone have a suggestion for the windows?
Can we take that one and put it in chat? And what we really, what is occurring to me is that we need a Q&A place where you can put your questions and people will supply the answers. So what is becoming clear from this exchange is how many different aspects this issue has, so many of which we haven't really dealt with, like the mufflers. I have not heard much about that before, the firecrackers, the loud music, and they all are different. And we're going to have different strategies for each of them. What you just heard from Arlene was a great example of how we need to develop different strategies. So we need discussions. That's the point of our opening this up. So I don't want to spend too much time working out on one particular issue. And there is something, I see many hands up, but there is something that we want to bring to the fore that we have not had a chance to talk about before. We have today with us Robin Happel, and her specialty is the impact on wildlife soundscape. So I'd like to ask Robin to say a few words about that. We heard from Grace Meng that personal stories have an impact. People also care when they realize the extraordinary impact on wildlife. So Robin. please.
Sure, thanks so much. Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief since I know there are just a lot of interest and really great discussion so far. So I formerly, before starting law school to pursue environmental law, I was a protected species observer. I'm looking at the impact of seismic surveying on whales and other marine mammals. So we know from a broad variety of research on marine organisms that when we look for offshore oil deposits, typically companies will be using sonar or other technologies to scan the seabed, which is broadly referred to as seismic surveying. And this is an extreme example of kind of localized noise pollution, and it can actually cause soft tissue damage to whales. There's also been research showing really plummeting levels of plankton in areas where seismic surveying is conducted. And this has not really been adequately included in environmental impact assessments. So that's one example of extreme impacts of noise on natural environments. My family is also originally from East Tennessee, and we've seen extreme impacts from mountaintop removal blasting in much of Appalachia. Unfortunately, a lot of state nuisance laws don't really provide a channel for people to challenge mining companies because state law tends to be extremely protective of extractive industries. So for a lot of people, these sound waves are not just annoying, but they actually cause damage to their homes. So over time, you can feel the blast actually ripple through your foundation. If you look at your door frames will become crooked over time just from this extreme localized blasting. So also like compressor stations and a lot of other industrial infrastructure can also have really severe localized impacts in addition to what we all face with airplane noise and like we've talked about leaf blowers and all these other local nuisances. So I think it's really important to remember wildlife as well as frontline and fence-line communities. They're dealing with really extreme impacts of extractive industries. And this has been such a great conference. Thanks again to Quiet Communities for organizing it. Really happy to be here.
Thank you. Paul Sperry.
Okay, thank you. Seeking to draw upon the legal support here, does FAA supersede all levels of government, or can communities legally legislate any local sound regulations? We live beneath an airport pattern here, and one of the few things that have worked here that I know of is asking airport managers, to promote voluntary noise abatement when there are no laws. And we did succeed in getting one jet that would take off at 4 a.m. every week, the same time, same day, to somehow find a different timing. Anyway, is there anything that we can do on local laws where they won't say we have to defer to FAA or some other national agency?
Again, I don't know if we're going to get the answer to that right now, but that was a really great idea to actually try the voluntary reduction. I just want to make sure that people are thinking of this opportunity that we have for another 15 minutes to share ideas on how we come together, not just talk about the particular problem that you're working on, but how we can actually move together on these problems and work as a group. Ellen. Ellen Fine.
Yes, thank you. The issue around here is, leaf blowers and for many people, and also, I'm reflecting on things like sports noise as well. Having lived in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, snowmobiling and things like that. And I keep thinking that some of our solutions lie more in and this is rare that I say something like this, but looking at a couple of things, what is the psychology around a person who needs the noise and believes that the noise is necessary to whatever task they're doing? We know that there are gun silencers, there are electric cars, there are electric leaf blowers, there are electric snowmobiles. So how do we push that sort of solutionary possibility of electric and quiet and make that enjoyable to the people who are making choices to use the noise on some of the, this is not going to solve the airplane problem, but it's going to solve some of these local problems. So how do we,
please mute yourself if you're
so
not.
how do we start thinking about that and make it kind of like, so many more people are driving Priuses now and things like that, and electric cars. So how do we make that a consumer and enviable choice that people would be choosing?
That would be that cultural change that we're talking about. And strategies for accomplishing that is what we ought to be doing. I don't know who BG is, but BG, you've got your hand up.
Okay, yes. That was a great question about that's a way that we could get together, I think, on much of this. Obviously, not on the airplanes and stuff. But what is it that causes these people to want to make all this noise? That's a great question. I mean, that's my main issue here in Washington Heights is loud blasting music at 1:30 in the morning from $10,000 sound systems in cars. And the question is, can we sue the companies that install the systems in the cars? Because it is against the law. What they're doing is against the law. It doesn't really get enforced. So what's the choice at that point? Do you sue the local authorities, or can you sue the companies that install the systems? Also, regarding the noise cameras that they're going to install, they're not meant to pick up the noise from the cars. We're talking about subwoofers that can generate noise that goes for blocks, because that's how sub bass works. It's a very long sound wave, and it takes a long time for it to even develop. Inside the car, it doesn't even sound as loud as it is outside the car. So, and people are installing these humongous systems, and in this neighborhood, people also walk around with big PA cabinets, and and a Bluetooth phone, and they just blast music in the middle of the street. And how do you stop that without some kind of actual law enforcement? Because there isn't any. And anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Well, one aspect, by the way, is brings us back to where we started, which is that if we had ONAC again, the Office of Noise Abatement and Control, setting standards for those products, that would be part of the answer. Another part of the answer would result from our conversations about how best to enforce it. So we always hear about noise. Nobody's enforcing it. That doesn't mean it's not enforceable. It means we haven't yet developed the right way to enforce it. So that should come out of our conversations, and we need to figure out how we can continue to have these conversations. Christopher.
Hi, I hope that was me. So I'm just wondering, there's all this talk about the various disconnected different kinds of problems. Has there been any effort to sort of put this all together and come up with like a priority list of what really are the biggest and second biggest and third biggest noise problems? Thank you.
Well, this is the effort that I know about. It's the first that I've been aware of that is of this scale and of this kind. And there hasn't been a prioritization except what emerges naturally. So as I mentioned before, we've done a lot of work on leaf blowers because people are really upset about that. We're talking about aircraft because people are upset about that. We haven't had a formal prioritizing exercise. It's something this group could do.
Sounds like that's an outstanding need. Thank you.
Mickey Barnes.
Hi, thank you so much for putting on this Zoom meeting. I wanted to make a couple comments on the aviation issue, particularly federal preemption. That what happens is that if an airport takes money from the FAA, then the FAA disempowers local communities who want to work on reducing noise and reducing lead emissions, whatever the case may be. So it seems to me what we need to do is eliminate grant assurances, take legal action, and then eliminate grant assurances as obstacles to blocking local communities. This came up in Santa Clara, where they had high lead levels. The Board of Supervisors banned leaded fuel and want to close the airport, but the federal preemption states that you have to continue poisoning your community with lead because you took money from the federal government. How barbarian is that? Now, the other piece is interstate commerce. There was a case, Seayer versus the city of New York, some years ago. And with the flight training, it does not meet federal preemption interstate commerce clause because the aircraft never leave the state. It's not interstate commerce. They stay within often the same county, the same jurisdiction. So, but again, they hadn't taken federal money So they weren't bound to the interstate commerce law. The federal preemption and grant assurances are the problem, and we need to legally change that. Local communities should have the right to advocate on behalf of the health and public welfare of their community. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. The opposite is also true, that we could build conditions for noise abatement into other grant provisions. So grants is a very good thing to focus on. Thank you for that point. Albert Kaufman, please.
Good morning from Portland, Oregon. Well, I wanted to just share that I've been working for about 5 years on the leaf blower issue here in my neighborhood, and I've really found that using Nextdoor is the best local organizing tool that I think has maybe ever existed. And I actually have days now where I don't hear leaf blowers. And so, trying to stop the flight of jets is a difficult thing. But when you start with having some success with, let's say, leaf blowers or other kinds of gas-powered equipment, you can start hearing birds sing again. And you can kind of educate people around you if you just stay on the issue. I've put a link in the chat around how the strategy that I've personally been using. And obviously we've got a group in Portland as well as working on this. And the other thing is, if you're really interested in this topic, the thing that really changes things is when people who care, like Representative Ming, run for office and actually are at the head of the table. I've seen, for instance, in Oakland, there's a council member who said, it shall be so, and basically banned leaf blowers overnight. And there was no uproar, there was no fight. There was just him saying, convincing his council members to do it. So there's lots of different levers to use. And I think we all I grew up in an era where we thought, oh, well, we have to convince representatives to make a change. And I think there's a lot we can do locally. And I highly recommend using Nextdoor. And I've got guidance for that if people are interested. And thanks for doing this.
Thank you very much. Doreen Tai.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, aircraft and other noxious noise is well documented to cause adverse effects to health, wildlife, children, and environments. I believe trying to tackle it at a local level, we need to convince our community leaders not to turn a blind eye for revenue purposes. We need to incentivize reason for our leaders to apply correction. How do we do this? Is there a financial breakdown we can reference and submit to our community leaders showing 5-year cost of health and mental health costs, environmental losses, educational losses, etc.? All the better if it's inclusive of other pollutants. If not, I'm willing to help someone pull this type of data together. Thank you. And awesome conference. Thank you. Very informative.
So I'm sure that Jamie, chair of the APHA committee, heard that about the costs. She's got all the materials from which you can generate those cost estimates.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not, Doreen, it's not perfect data because we need so much more data to estimate these kinds of costs. And as I mentioned, this has not been a well-funded area, but there's enough to get started. And there's been some economic studies done that have estimated these external costs.
So there's a great deal to say. We're nearing the end of time here. I want David Siegel, at least one more comment. We'll see if we have room for more than that. David. You're muted.
David Siegel from Boulder, Colorado. Mickey Barnes stole most of my thunder talking about the leaded gas problem. Obviously, the ever-present problem here is low-flying aircraft and noise, but the hidden danger clearly is lead pollution. In the Front Range of Colorado, we have a lot of temperature inversions because we're up against the mountains. And I'm wondering if we can leverage EPA guidelines on lead to force this issue. I saw a study that bald eagles around airports had like 42 times the normal lead in their bodies than normal. So I'm wondering, is there a mechanism to force some studies? And if it's determined that lead pollution is a problem, like we got lead out of cars, can we force these, airports to stop using avgas and maybe reduce some of these low-flying planes? Could that be used as leverage?
So I will just say, I'm an environmentalist. I also work on lead. And you should go to LeadNet, which is the listserv for people who work on lead, and you should post that question and you will get answers. You can also Google lead in wildlife and you will find people who will get you the answers to that. If that doesn't work, look up Mark Pokras, P-O-K-R-A-S. Let's move on quickly. I think we have a few more minutes. Elise Shortell.
Hi there. I'm a commissioner on a city council in a very small city within the metropolitan area of Atlanta. So it's been really interesting hearing this discussion. So 2 questions from me. I'm actually on what I would call a split commission in terms of dealing with noise from leaf blowers. But in terms of organizing to make an impact, is there some data list, or is it possible to start generating a list of communities that have taken action in terms of the echo, so that other communities like my own would know who those communities are and could start making connections with them? Because in our case, we are a very small community. There's no way in heck we could ever afford to sue a manufacturer, anything like that. But there's beauty in numbers. So that's my first question. The second question is, at our state legislature level, we currently have someone trying to get a law passed before the session ends that would ban municipalities from putting any restrictions on leaf blowers. To me, that seems like it's not lawful, given what I've heard today about the Noise Control Act. Can anyone speak to that? Thank you.
I'm going to open that up to the other speakers, experts, discussants now. We have just a few more minutes for closing comments. And I would like to ask the other presenters if they have anything they want to add at this point before we close it up.
Rick, I just want to make a comment. I'm not commenting on the preemption issue. I'll leave that to the attorneys. But on the leaf blower issue, we've done a lot of work on this, and there's a lot of different approaches. There's the ordinance approach, but then, as my friend Dan Mabe says, regulation without resources is a difficult way to go. So it's really a broad conversation. There's positive approaches. Reasonable regulation can give a push, but we're really talking about trying to transform that whole industry where the gas model has predominated. But this is a conversation we'll definitely take offline. We can have future meetings dedicated to it and work together with each other to try and make this happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the answer is there isn't that mechanism available under the federal law. Once something is preempted, there's really nothing that local communities can do in respect to whatever has been preempted. So I wish I had a different answer, but I can't hold out too much hope on that score.
May I make a comment? Someone said that this is indeed a medical issue. Yes, indeed it is. It wasn't just EPA that called it a health problem, but if you look at some of the works of the Harvard Medical School Health Letter 30 years ago, in a page 1 story from Medical School Health Letter, we declared this a problem, a health issue. And I agree, more medical people should get involved. I'm a psychologist, and I have to say psychologists have gotten involved in this issue early on, and I'm pleased about that. But noise has been demonstrated to show that it actually affects our mental and physical health. May I add one thing that did not come up, and I urge you to look at this. Noise also can lead to people becoming aggressive. And recently in New York City, there was a murder over a noise annoyance. So it is also a crime issue. And the other thing police should also be aware of, that if there's noise in a household, it might be a child being beaten, a wife being beaten, a husband being abused. Noise can also let us know that there will be potential crimes in homes if we don't attend to it. So I would urge everyone to work to get the police in their cities to become more involved in this issue, because it is related to crime, and I've written a paper on it, and I'd like people to be able to access it. You can look it up by just typing my name in. So it is. And one last point, we talk about money. And yes, Jamie, we may not have studied how much it's cost us in terms of money spent on health issues. But when people go to hospitals because of increased medical problems like cardiovascular diseases, that costs money. So any argument that it will cost some money to lessen the noise will be counteracted by the fact that it costs millions of dollars to treat people with health issues caused by noise, and children in schools whose learning have been intruded upon, and teachers whose lives have been made more difficult in being able to teach. That costs money too. So I wanted to just leave this. It is a money issue, but I think the cost is greater to remedy it with respect to health than to treat it beforehand and remedy the problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Trish and I are gonna, I think we have to wrap it up now. It's 2:00. We have a responsibility to end it on time or somewhere around there. So Trish, do you want me to make my closing comments first?
Yes, please.
All right. So I just want to say that Quiet Communities was, after long work, we finally, thanks to Chuck and Arlene and others, we finally got a meeting with the head people at EPA, and we told them that they needed to restore the program. And you know what they said to us? We don't hear about this problem. So we're all too quiet about noise. And we have to find a way to make noise about noise. And we can do that in a stupid way that gets people's back up and gets them to resist us and gets us to see us as people who are taking away their freedom. Or we can do it in a way that wakes them up and makes them stop behaving like bad children, which is the way I think about those mufflers and the loud noise and the firecrackers under your window. There are a lot of aspects to this, and there are a lot of ways to approach it. And the best way to approach it will emerge from us working together. So I had this whole different vision for this conversation. I was so naive. I thought that we would be talking about strategies for, how we compare our notes and how we figure out the best machines to use and the best way to find consultants and the best way to get those sound barriers built up on the highways when we rebuild our infrastructure so that the EJ communities finally get some relief, the best way to get that money flowing for roofs for houses under aircraft, and the best way to really convince the changes, the agencies to make the changes and the manufacturers, whether we have laws or not, the cultural change. How do we do that? Our strategies, we need to compare, we need to develop them, we need to refine them. So we are hoping that this is the beginning of a big national conversation on quiet. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Rick. And thank you, everyone, speakers, participants. Sorry we didn't get to all of the amazing questions and comments. As we said, we will have future conferences, so please keep an eye out in your email. We're hoping the next in this series will be in June. I echo what Rick says. This movement is all about giving quiet a voice through community collaboration. The more people we welcome to the conversation, the louder our voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.